And good to go.
A very warm welcome to everyone to this presidential session on fixing U.S. immigration and asylum policy. Where to begin? Remarkably, the policy environment for reforming the U.S. immigration system is even more complicated and more daunting than it was a year ago when I proposed this panel. The narrow window for passing new legislation in Congress has closed, leaving us with zero prospects for constructive legislative fixes this year, and probably not until after the 2024 election cycle at the earliest. Indeed, one of the big picture questions that I have asked our panelists to address today is what the non-legislative road to progressive immigration change might look like in each of the policy areas with which they are concerned. How much realistically can be done through executive actions and regulatory changes alone? My concept for this panel was to showcase the work of a new generation of immigration scholars who are doing policy-oriented research in a variety of disciplines. Mexico City-based politologo Jorge Schiavon may not think of himself as Nueva Generación, but Jorge's work on the international diplomacy of immigration and asylum issues is fresh and thought-provoking. What are the prospects for truly regional approaches to border management? Can we move beyond stashing asylum seekers in makeshift shelters on the Mexican side of the US southern border and pressuring Mexico to do more to keep asylum seekers from getting anywhere near that border? Another perspective on border management will be provided by political scientist Mike Slaven, who kindly agreed to stay up until an ungodly hour in the UK where he is based. Mike has a new book coming out this spring on the border wars in the state of Arizona and how they have influenced the national level immigration policy debate. Tonight, he will be delving further into the partisan politics of immigration, and he'll also discuss how the business community is responding to state and local immigration enforcement policies. David Hausman brings the toolkits of both a legal scholar and a political scientist to the panel. He will be starting an appointment at UC Berkeley Law School in September. He has produced the most comprehensive inventory of the more than 1,000 regressive, retrogressive policy and rule changes implemented by the Trump administration on immigration. His more recent work has focused on the unintended consequences of relying on local police to boost immigration arrests in the US interior. Finally, economist Chloe East has done pioneering work documenting the effects of immigration enforcement on the labor supply for essential jobs like childcare. Today, she'll be talking about the negative economic impact of the currently reduced level of legal immigration to the US and the negative consequences of limited safety net access for immigrants already in the United States. I've asked each of our panelists to identify one specific element of the current immigration and asylum system that they would prioritize for reform and what that fix might look like. Each panelist will have up to 15 minutes to present their work, which should give us a half hour for Q&A. Jorge Schiavon, please get us started.
Well, thank you, Wayne, for organizing this panel. It's a true honor sharing it with leading experts in
migration, and more specifically with a living legend, with my professor, Wayne Cornelius, who is the leading scholar in US-Mexico migration, and from which I have learned so much since he was my professor at UCSD. So what I'll try to do is explain what is the current situation in what I call the Meso-North American migration system that, as you very well know, includes Canada, the US, and Mexico, the Northern Triangle of Central America, and the Western Caribbean. For that, I have prepared a very short PowerPoint presentation, which I will be sharing with you in this precise moment. And what I'll try to do is, since this is a presidential panel and the idea is for it to be for non-experts, I will try to give the general panorama, for then my colleagues can go deeply into the different issues that Professor Cornelius has already stated in his introduction. The first thing I would like to do is to say, we know what migration is. It's the movement of population from one territory to another, but what we also know is that the most of the time it is not voluntary. And in terms of numbers, we always think about migration as generating crisis. The truth is, we're only talking of approximately 300 million people, of which only 20% are irregular migrants, and 90% of all this migration is intra-regional. What's interesting to know, and US experts definitely know this, is that even it's only a little bit more than 3% of the population of the world who can be considered a migrant, they produce almost 8% of the global GDP. That means that migrants are considerably more productive than nationals of the countries of reception. And also, as you very well know, the vast majority of what is produced, the benefits of the work of migrants, stay in the countries of destination, close to 90%. Only 10% goes back to the countries of origin, mostly in the form of remittances. But what's also interesting to know is what are the biggest problems when we try to analyze migration in current affairs. And I believe one of the biggest problems is the myths and obsessions that we have in terms of analyzing migration. And the first and most important one is that countries tend to focus only in one of the four relevant components of migration, which are immigration, those who go from here to there, immigration, those who come from there to here, migration in transit, those who come from there through my country to a third country, and finally returning migrants. And the obsession is normally on that issue which generates a crisis in your country. For example, the US is mostly interested in immigration, but it doesn't understand that we also have almost 1.5 million Americans living in Mexico. So it's also a country of immigration by now. And also what's very important is when we study migration, we have to do it through migration systems and not only through unilateral or bilateral actions of states. And this is especially true in the case of the Meso-North American migration system, because it is, yes, centered in the US and Canada as the most important countries of destination, but Mexico is becoming a country of destination, and the other countries also face the four components of the migration phenomenon. Also, it's relevant to see in a multi-causal way, not only trying to understand the push factors, that is those factors which make you leave a country, but also very important to see which are the pull factors. Why do migrants, for example, from Central America go to the US or try to go to the US and Canada, and why don't they go, for example, to Nicaragua or to Cuba? So it's also a matter of understanding the different variables which are relevant. And finally, we have to do it in a multi-actor and multidisciplinary way, trying to understand the rationality behind the decision to migrate. And also it's relevant for a better understanding of migration, to understand migration as a shared responsibility, not a problem, but a phenomenon which needs the cooperation of countries of transit, origin, destination, and returning migrants. Now, as you very well know, if we want to analyze migration, we have to do it by what's called the 5 C's of good migration policies. What are these 5 C's? They are coherence, consistence, cooperation, coordination, and co-responsibility. Coherence, it's very easy. What you request from the countries of the North, you should also do in terms of the respect of the human rights and the rights in general of migrants in the countries of the global South. Consistency, yes, every country is sovereign in terms of defining its preferred migration law and policy, but it has to be consistent with the other responsibilities that it has in terms of rule of law and human rights. Cooperation, yes, it's absolutely necessary in a migration system for countries of origin, transit, destination, and return migrants to cooperate to try to find a better administration of the phenomenon. Coordination, and this is probably one of the biggest problems that we face currently in the Mexican case and also in Central America and also in the US, it's coordination between some national governments and the central governments or federal governments, between the different ministries in charge of migration. In the case of Mexico, the Ministry of Gobernación or the Interior and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is now responsible for the coordination of migration in the country. And it has been a huge failure, to say the least, but also international coordination. And finally, what is increasingly relevant is to see that co-responsibility of countries of origin, transit, destination, and return in terms of the migration phenomena. So how relevant is the phenomenon right now in terms of our system, specifically based in the case of Mexico? Well, 10% of the Mexican population is currently a first-generation migrant in the United States. Of the 125 million Mexicans that we have currently approximately 12 million Mexicans of first generation living in the US. But if you also take into consideration second, third, and other generations, we're talking about approximately 36 million people of Mexican origin living in the US. 12 million first generation, 12 million second generation, and 12 million third and other generations. So this means that it is approximately 10% of the US population. And what's interesting to see is how relevant it is for Mexico. When we asked in a survey that we conduct at CIDE every 2 years, which is called Mexico, the Americas, and the World, if you have a relative living outside the country, 98% of them in the US, 54% of Mexicans say yes. So migration is something that is happening with your family and within your society. And 12% of Mexicans today receive remittances. As you know, they're breaking records. We don't know if it's only remittances or also some gray or black money there, but it's almost close to $40 billion last year, and most probably will be more this year. And in the case of Central America, that is even more important because we also have 10% of their population being migrants, 3 million migrants of a population of 35 million people. But what's even more important for them is remittances. They represent 6% of the GDP of the region. In cases of El Salvador, it's over 10%. And it is considerably more than what Central America receives in terms of foreign direct investment. 16 billion of remittances, 2.7 in foreign direct investment, and only 1.2 billion in terms of international cooperation for development. So that's how relevant it is, not only in terms of it's part of my family, it's part also of the possibility of having an economic life in the countries of origin through remittances. So what we see currently are huge changes in the migration system in Meso North America. First, Mexican migration, as you very well know, went to a net zero by year 2010. But what's happening after COVID-19, especially 2021 and now 2022, is that once again, we're seeing a positive migration for Mexicans trying to go into the United States. But what's interesting is also the composition of the first generation Mexicans in the US. As you know, there used to be 12 million, but now there are only 10.5 million due to deportations. But approximately from those 6 million, 50% are in a regular situation. 6 million of them, now it's only 4.8 million due to deportations, are in an irregular situation. But what's interesting to know is that from the 6 million which are regular, 3 are already binational. They're dual nationals of Mexico and the US. 1.5 million could become US citizens because they have all the necessary documentation and time to do it, and 1.5 million not yet, but they could in some years. But what's also interesting in terms of those who are in an irregular situation in the US is that approximately 40% of them have been more than 10 years in the US, and another 40% have been between 5 and 10 years. So it's only 20% of those 6 million, that is approximately 1 million, 1.2 million, which are newer migrants. And obviously, when we talk about people being 5, 10, or more years in the US, that means that they have been perfectly situated within U.S. society and also the U.S. economy, and they have most of them binational families, et cetera, et cetera. So what we also see is a dramatic change in terms of returning migrants from the U.S. to Mexico, more than 3 million in the last 5 years. And what's also interesting is how this returning migration has taken place, but because now it's not only that irregular migrants who are being deported back to Mexico, but they come with their families. Many of them are binational, and especially binational children. Today, we have over 700,000 binational children in Mexico that came with their parents through the process of deportation, and that obviously implies that they have to be inserted within the Mexican educational system, and also they have to be provided with consular protection by U.S. authorities. So it's also something that has to be taken into consideration when we talk about the system, because a system includes all the components within it. Also, what's interesting about migration in transit is that it's not a new phenomenon. We were having Central Americans crossing through Mexico since the mid-2000s, that is since 2005, we have only approximately 500,000 Central Americans crossing through Mexico. It goes down after the crisis of 2009, 2010 to only 110,000, and now it's going up, and most probably this year, 2022, we will break the historic barrier of over 1 million Central Americans crossing through Mexico going to the US. But also what has changed is that 92% of them used to be from 3 countries, the 3 countries of the Northern Triangle of Central America. Today, what we're seeing is increasing numbers of Cubans, Venezuelans, and also people from Haiti, but also extra regional migrants, which come through South America or Central America, try to cross through come into Mexico and try to go into the US. So what we see also is changes in terms of who is doing the dirty job of detaining and deporting these migrants. And Mexico had done the vast majority of this job in the past, and we stopped doing it after San Fernando, and now we are doing it again, and I'll show you the information. And finally, in terms of immigration, the data in Mexico says that there's less than 1 million immigrants in Mexico, and from those, only like 100,000 come from Central America. Obviously, these numbers are wrong, because we know that we have at least 1.5 million US citizens living in Mexico, from which approximately 700,000 are children and dual nationals, many of them. So now let me show you all this information in graphs, and I will go faster with this. The probability of taking a first trip into the US has dramatically gone down for the case of Mexicans, almost going into 0 by 2017. Once again, as I said, by year 2021-22, it's once again positive. But what's interesting here is that the probability of returning after a first trip, if you are a documented migrant, is very high. That means that documented migration generates a migration which is circular, and if you're an undocumented migrant, then the probability of going back to your country is very low, because it is so expensive and so difficult now to enter irregularly into the US that once you're there, you stay there. So these are unintended consequences of a tougher US migration policy. But here's probably one of the most beautiful graphs that you'll see in your whole life in terms of how has the Mexican migration in the US changed from being mostly undocumented, 90% of it, to today being mostly documented and temporary workers. And if you don't like this one, I'll show you this one. And just see the numbers. Approximately by year 2000, we had approximately 300,000 undocumented migrants going every year into the US. Well, today, you have approximately 900 Mexican temporary workers going into the US, and this is information from Homeland Security. So what we've seen is a huge change in terms of how Mexican migrants are in the US. And we also see a change into where they go. In the past, almost 80% were in 3 states, which were California, Texas, and Illinois. Today, we have migrants in the 50 US states, and that also is a huge challenge for Mexican protection abroad. And that also explains why Mexico today has 50 consulates in practically every relevant city where there are migrants in the US territory. But what has changed dramatically in the course of the last years is the share of countries of origin. And that is Mexicans, who were 90% of those who were being apprehended, are now only 38% and going down, while Central Americans are, if you sum these 3 countries, over 50%. And what's also probably most important is the composition of border apprehensions. What we used to have only 10 years ago was that most of them, almost 70%, were young males who were workers. And today what you see is unaccompanied minors and families. So it's very different to receive migrants who come to work to migrants which require public policies. And that's to some extent also explains changing migration policy in the United States. So these are the numbers that I was telling you. By 2005, we already had approximately 418,000 Central Americans. We will cross the 1 million number in 2022. And this is something that few people know. And I'll close with this one, and that is who does the detentions and apprehensions? Well, the blue line is Mexico. We used to do it. The red line is the US, and now Mexico is doing detentions and deportations of approximately 75% of those crossing the country, and the US is only doing around 25%. So with this, and the probability of doing it successfully is only 10% today. It used to be 24% only a decade ago for Central Americans crossing the country. Once again, thank you for organizing this panel, Wayne, and I hope we have a wonderful discussion.
Thank you so much, Jorge. Anybody watching this, if you would like the slides to be sent to you, send me an email and I'll be happy to forward them to you. Mike Slaven, coming to us from Lincolnshire, England, please go right ahead.
Thanks, and thanks for having me here. It's a real honor. I'm going to, after Jorge gave us such a great overview of the complexity and the changing nature of the situation, maybe talk about, I don't know, the inability of the political system to deal effectively with a complex and important situation. So I'm just going to structure it around a kind of 4 observations about the politics of immigration and asylum in the US. These come from the book that Wayne mentioned earlier, which is actually out in August. Is supposed to be out in the spring, but I guess there are problems printing books in general right now. But one of the questions that I was looking at and kind of investigating, as Wayne said, the border wars in Arizona is, why is it that there's such a tendency to get kind of security-oriented policy toward immigration when actually there's a lot of potential political support for a bunch of different approaches? And when security, if you're talking about fixing the US system, security is at best a partial and arguably an entirely misguided frame to understand this. But why is there such a tendency from policymakers to give us border security or enforcement? And so I kind of did this deep dive into this era of intense border security politics in Arizona, and which kind of was epitomized by Senate Bill 1070, which was the law that was passed in 2010, which was very controversial. And then kind of what happened after that, which was perhaps surprisingly, there was a reaction to that has led to a relative decline of these issues in Arizona. So it's no longer as dominant an issue as it was. It operates more like a normal agenda item now. But kind of what can we learn from this in terms of how this all works? What can we and what do we see today? So I guess maybe to go into the dismal aspects of that Wayne was alluding to. One of the first thing I would observe is that we now have this kind of predictable policy entrepreneurship on the right, which complicates fixing anything, in part because it provides this a foil against reform attempts to see this in a more complex way, kind of against a lot of assumptions about how security works politically that might be in the literature on securitization, which would see this as being something that's kind of commanded by top leaders and it consolidates support when it's something is a security issue. Actually, it gives a lot of opportunities for people all over the political space to kind of to get involved, because it carries these implications of responsibility for anyone who can help. If you can do something about this problem, you should be doing something about this problem. So we at the state level who have no real tools or authority to do much productive about it are going to get involved in this. Of course, Arizona was a pioneer for this. We're seeing it now, of course, in Texas, which is the photo of Governor Greg Abbott running for re-election this year. And so we now have this kind of predictable phenomenon where state and local officials are going to be getting involved in some way. The questions that arise from this are not really, is this going to fix anything? Because it almost certainly will not fix anything. How much material damage are these interventions going to cause in terms of making enforcement more complex or arriving at a political solution to this, to the complex immigration issues more attainable? One question is, while at least in Arizona 10, 15 years ago, there was a sense that these sorts of interventions were aimed at not just at the right, but at the political center, and that this was allowing people to win electoral majorities by arguing that they're doing something about this important issue. Is that the case anymore, or is this just kind of appealing to a right-wing audience, to the core electorate of the Republican Party? And will these antagonize minority voters? Will this provoke a backlash? I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes, but so something we can now expect now is that fixing U.S. immigration policy is going to be complicated by these sorts of actors. And, unfortunately, the Democrats are operating off the back foot kind of in a chronic way. And one of the reasons for this is that it's not that Trump, for instance, offered a vision of immigration and the border that was widely appealing to people. It was not really. It was intensely popular among a narrow segment of the population, but not generally popular. But once the Democrats are in power and they're getting this pushback from Republican governors, from Congress, there is a tendency to look toward providing this. There's a competition around providing security, right? And well, if we talk about what we're going to do that might alleviate a different portion of the problem or prioritize something different, that won't seem to resonate in these communication environments. The message from, for instance, the Republican governors or more right-wing figures is that there's this security problem. It's amazing when you look at, if you look at the salience polls, immigration is significant right now in the U.S., but that comes almost entirely from one side of the political divide that really drives this kind of discursive phenomenon. So Democrats kind of get stuck in this position where, okay, well, we need to look like we're providing security. The voters that want this aren't really going to trust us to do it, and are going to, of course, there's always these moving targets over what enough security is or what constitutes security. And the basic fact is that immigration is still not really atop the party agenda. And this is true of the Democrats, it's true of center-left parties in the global north in general. Immigration is not really an issue that they welcome being a major issue. It's something that's usually a distraction from other things that they regard as more important. And when that's the case, they're going to kind of look for a satisficing option on immigration and say, okay, well, what can kind of keep this from becoming a problem for us? Can we kind of deal with this in an adequate way? And there won't be a lot of political capital spent on trying to challenge the framings that are a problem, because they would rather be talking about some other thing. So this chronically, things are kind of on the back foot there. Unfortunately, you might think, well, business provides an opportunity to get some elements of the Republican coalition that will kind of push back against these things. And eventually in Arizona, this is what happened. Senate Bill 1070 was passed. This caused a huge furor in Arizona, and eventually business kind of intervened to get the parts of the Republican Party most sympathetic to them to put the brakes on this kind of thing, which is why you haven't seen anything quite like that happen in the past decade. But the longer story is that business was very reluctant to intervene on these sorts of things. So the classic kind of political economy literature says, well, businesses are pro-immigration. Generally, they need workers. They're going to favor expansionary policy, and they're going to capture the policy-making system quite effectively. Unfortunately, I don't really think that's exactly how I have seen it working. The reality is that they'll tolerate a lot of anti-immigrant posturing from their normal allies, which is typically the Republican Party. It's not that it does anything for them. It's not that this is appealing to business, but they don't really like getting involved in these sorts of social controversies if they can help it. And they're only going to get involved if it starts to become really damaging. And in fact, because they have such good elite connections, they can normally intervene quite narrowly to make sure that whatever's happening doesn't hurt them specifically, and kind of leave the larger anti-immigrant political environment to develop. So they don't really actually intervene to stop that from happening, to stop an anti-immigrant or hugely security obsessed way of thinking about this. They don't intervene to stop that unless it gets really bad for them. So we see, for instance, in Texas, Greg Abbott's recent decision to start inspecting all of the cargo coming across the highways. This was a huge disaster. I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but perishable goods just rotting in in trucks that are stopped because of these inspections that as far as I understand, have turned up absolutely nothing. And in those sorts of things, I guess the Chamber of Commerce can eventually say, okay, this needs to end. As to whether that leads to any larger kind of political realignment away from this sort of brinksmanship or kind of stunt performance is a much bigger question. I would suggest is unlikely to happen unless things get very bad. So there is potential there, but maybe very difficult to realize. And just kind of leading on to this, well, you would say, well, aren't the people who are driving this a kind of unhelpful conversation concerned about this getting politically toxic? Look what happened in Arizona, which is now a swing state for political purposes. Did not used to be that way. Look what happened in California before that with in the 90s. Well, there is a lot that is possible before this gets politically toxic. And I would suggest that, it's very possible that the Republican politicians have learned from these experiences and the lines that are particularly dangerous to cross. The Texas Republicans historically have been better have been more mindful to not antagonize Mexican-American voters in Texas, more so than in Arizona and in California. And they kind of are probably aware of what really provoked backlash in these cases, which is not, inspections of trucks, but measures which seem to directly target not simply immigrants, but perhaps the wider community of Mexican Americans as well. And the Republicans are unlikely to deviate from an approach which is largely popular among their voters without either severe electoral consequences, which are difficult to imagine, or decisive business intervention, which is also difficult to imagine for the purposes I talked about. So you have these dynamics going on in the Republican Party. There is some potential for pushback at some stage, and then the dynamics in the Democratic Party where, well, the energy and the capital is unlikely to be spent to really turn a different direction on this because it's not a dominant issue. Are we doomed forever? No, not forever. And in fact, one of the purposes of the work I was doing is to say, well, what happened in Arizona in 2011, 2012, and since, where this issue has to some extent cooled off, would not have been predictable even a few years before that started. So things can change. It is not, we are not dealing with dynamics that are written in stone forever. But at least my research suggests, first of all, for a need for business more broadly to get involved in these issues, for things to change productively. But that is a difficult thing to capture. And what is the relationship between the Republican Party and business right now with everything going on at Disney in Florida? And it's unclear to me what exactly is happening there and where that's going to lead, if anywhere, but worth keeping an eye on for these purposes because business has been such an important constituency to get the Republicans involved in some kind of not completely security-oriented or destructive forms of immigration policy. There is a need for activist pressure to continually reorient the Democrats on the issue, to get this to a state where these are issues where the Democrats are willing to invest political capital to steer away from this kind of ultimately unproductive competition about who can provide security adequately. And I would say that the public discussions of immigration and asylum policy there's all sorts of research saying, present people with facts and immigration, and they don't really respond to this because they have, motivated reasoning. But over time, these do cause changes. It causes changes in the way that people can understand the importance of these policies or what's going on. And there is a continued need for that. And dynamics do change. Things do eventually change. For as dismal as I'm being, and for as correct as Wayne is in saying that we are looking out upon an unfavorable environment for at least the foreseeable future, there are reasons to think that perhaps later on things can be more productive. So I will stop there and hand over. Thanks very much for having me again.
Thanks very much. Very interesting indeed. I'm making notes of questions that could be asked during the Q&A period. I hope the rest of you will be doing that too. Let's finish up. Well, no, let's go now to David Hausman. David, please jump right in.
Great, thank you so much. It's just amazing to be part of this panel as kind of a baby professor, and to get this chance to participate and hear what you all have to say. So let me start. So what I want to do today is talk a bit about some descriptive empirical research that I've been working on interior deportations, and then actually try to offer a kind of tiny sliver of good news about where things are under the Biden administration during a time that I think everyone is correctly saying is very grim. And so this research is about interior deportations, and those are deportations that start with an arrest by Immigration and Customs Enforcement within the United States, away from the border, so not at the border itself. And there's just a huge amount of enforcement leeway in those arrests and deportations because there are over 10 million undocumented people in the United States, and under 1% are actually deported in any given year. And so a kind of standard account of this under enforcement is that it raises an arbitrariness problem. And so especially that sympathetic people who haven't committed any crimes can still get swept into the deportation dragnet. And this very much seemed right to me when I was an immigrants' rights lawyer before I moved into academia. And in fact, I used to think about the deportation system as kind of like a game of chutes and ladders designed by a sadist. So in this kind of standard account, it's really randomness and lawlessness that are the key features of interior enforcement. And so since I've stopped being a lawyer and I've started to do a little bit more empirical work, I started to think that this account kind of misses a broader, actually very law-like pattern in the experiences of people who are facing deportation. And that pattern is basically that criminal convictions drive deportation decisions. And so what I find descriptively in this research is that you're actually hundreds of times more likely to be deported from the interior if you've been convicted of a crime than if you haven't. And so instead of thinking of the system as like a game of chutes and ladders, you might think of it as one big chute, which is the criminal justice system. Then it turns out that this big chute still really looks like it was designed by a sadist, in the sense that prioritizing by criminality has this really disastrous consequence of leading the government to deport people who've lived here for a very long time. And so I want to talk about three things, all very briefly. First, I'll describe why the immigration enforcement system tends to be a little bit more effective at prioritizing than you might initially think. And then second, I'll explain why that prioritization leads the government to deport people who have strong ties to the United States, who've lived here for a long time. And then finally, I'll just show briefly that interior enforcement has actually dropped quite a bit and remained low under the Biden administration. And maybe that's because of the pandemic, but I think that that is one piece of relatively good news. So let me start with this descriptive point. So it turns out that the interior deportation system prioritizes a lot by criminal convictions, even when the president isn't trying to do that. So even, for example, under the Trump administration. And that's actually for the mechanical reason that the immigration enforcement system piggybacks on arrests by local police to find people in the interior to deport. And so enforcement starts with this pool of people who are disproportionately likely to have been convicted of crimes. And that means that non-citizens who have been convicted of crimes are actually more likely than not to be deported, whereas undocumented people who don't have any criminal convictions have under a 1 in 1,000 chance of being deported. And so that's how I reached this statement that you're hundreds of times more likely to be deported if you've been convicted of a crime than if you haven't. And I realize that that fact might seem very obvious, but as far as I know, it is new in this work. And I think part of the reason that it's easy to miss, and that I also missed it for a very long time, is that advocates and scholars have been caught up in this debate, which we should be having, over the level of enforcement. But we've tended to, in that debate, take the principle of prioritization for granted. And so in the terms of that debate, if you favor less enforcement, you tend to want more prioritization by criminal convictions. And so in this research, I try to flip that and set aside just very briefly questions about the right level of enforcement. And you'll see that I do have views on those, but instead think directly about the consequences of the executive's current approach to prioritization. And there are actually very good reasons to think that prioritizing by criminal convictions leads the government systematically to deport people with deep roots in the United States. So policymakers often describe these roots as ties to the country, and that's the word I use here. But I'm actually thinking most of all of just length of time in the United States, but also family and community ties that come with that. And of course, stronger ties increase the cost and the harm of deportation. And they're also a kind of indicator of social membership in the country. And then it's not surprising that our statutory framework depends on family and employment ties in all sorts of contexts to determine who can enter the United States in the first place. So there's actually this weird mismatch between our focus on these ties in that statutory context and our lack of focus on those ties in these executive decisions about who to prioritize for deportation. And that mismatch, I think, is especially bizarre because deporting people who have strong ties basically means tearing families apart. And so there are, I think, really compelling reasons to deprioritize enforcement against people with strong ties. But of course, I realize that you might give me some reasons to prioritize by criminal convictions. And I ultimately don't think that those reasons are that persuasive, but I'm going to set that aside here in the interest of time. And whatever those possible reasons are, I want to suggest that one way to think about that trade-off is to imagine it as having two dimensions. So this figure shows an imaginary distribution of criminality and ties in the undocumented population. So on the vertical axis here is criminality with people who've been convicted of crimes up here near the top. On the horizontal axis is the strength of ties, so people with stronger ties who've lived in the US longer out here towards the right. And this distribution is imaginary because we don't actually exactly know how ties and criminality are correlated, but we do know a few things. So one thing we do know is that a large majority of the undocumented population both hasn't been convicted of any crimes and has strong ties to the United States. So that's this group marked in blue. And the reason we know this is that we know that ties are very strong on average. So here in the middle, most undocumented people have been in the US over a decade. Over 80% live together with a close family member. And by contrast, under 1% are actually locked up for a crime. And so unless the government is going to vastly increase deportations, I think we can agree that the non-citizens in this group marked in blue shouldn't be priorities for deportation. And then conversely, up here at the top left-hand corner, these just few dots marked in orange are people who've recently entered the United States who've been convicted of serious crimes. So you might imagine somebody convicted of human trafficking soon after entering the United States. And unless we're going to stop deportations entirely, and I think there might be good arguments for that, I think most people would likely agree that the government should prioritize this group for deportation. But the way that policy currently works is that it essentially draws a horizontal line across the top of this graph, and the government tries to deport everyone with any criminal conviction, regardless of how strong those people's ties are. Now, just how much harm that current policy causes does depend a lot on facts. So if you imagine a state of the world in which undocumented people who are convicted of crimes have stronger ties on average, so that would look like this, the current policy would just be an unmitigated disaster because the government would be systematically targeting people with the very strongest ties. And to be clear, we don't know whether this is true. You might imagine that the opposite is true. And that's what President Obama seemed to imagine when he once said that he'd deport felons, not families. So you might imagine then that people convicted of felonies most likely don't have family members here. But it turns out that even if the world looks this way, and we don't know, then our current policy will still cause a huge amount of harm because there'll still be lots of people here who have average ties, which are very strong, who are being deported. And so the key point here is that unless there's an almost perfect correlation between ties and criminality, there will be this very strong trade-off between prioritizing enforcement against people with very weak ties and prioritizing enforcement against people with criminal convictions. And so what this means, to me at least, is that interior deportations, as they currently stand, are pretty catastrophically harmful. And that actually leads to what I think is the sliver of good news right now, which is that interior enforcement has decreased quite a lot under the Biden administration. And so this last slide shows enforcement trends from 2019 until now. And what this shows in particular is bookends to detention over time. And the dashed line up here is bookends to detention that result from border arrests. And the solid line is bookends that result from interior arrests. And in border arrests, you can see some patterns that are likely familiar, where there was first a decline in these as the Trump administration instituted its asylum ban, and then that decline continued as the pandemic took effect, and really there were very few of these during most of 2020. And then we saw an increase under the Biden administration as arrivals increased at the border. I don't know what's happening with this large dip in September 2021. I'm interested in thoughts about that. But the trend that I actually want to highlight here is the trend, the solid line. So we see this, the number of interior arrests was pretty level under the Trump administration for a long time. It dipped quite dramatically at the beginning of the pandemic, stayed at that level, and then it dipped again a lot at the beginning of the Biden administration. And we've seen it increase a little bit, but not all that much since. And so I think that's the one small bright spot in the otherwise very grim story of recent immigration enforcement policy. So I'll leave it there, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you so much. Let's move without delay to Chloe. You there?
Hold on, let me just.
Chloe East from Colorado.
Thank you.
I think that's where you are.
Yes, I am in Denver.
Very good. Take it away.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here as part of this panel. I still feel like a baby professor like you, David, even though I have been doing this for a while. So I don't know how quickly that feeling goes away, but I'm happy to be here and tell you a little bit about my work and how it relates to what we know about the COVID economic crisis and how it affected immigration and how immigrants were affected by it. So I'm going to start by talking about kind of picking up a little bit on what David was talking about. There have been many limits to migration into the US as a result of the pandemic. This includes, the Remain in Mexico program, major delays in visa processing that we've seen, among others. And this has actually led to a pretty bleak economic picture as well. And so the estimates suggest that there's about 2 million fewer foreign-born individuals in the US now than there would be if immigration had continued at the pace that it was prior to the pandemic. And what this graph is showing you is that that actually really affected the labor force that we saw during the pandemic, what a lot of people called the labor shortage, which I don't love because I think that puts the blame on workers in an incredibly unfair way, but what people did call the labor shortage. So what this graph is showing you is the horizontal axis is the share of foreign-born workers in an industry or occupation prior to the pandemic. So basically how, immigrant intensive was the industry, and then the vertical axis is the rate of unfilled jobs in 2021 when there was this big discussion about the labor shortage. And so what you can see here is basically that there is a positive relationship between those two things. So industries that had heavily relied on immigrants had a much harder time filling jobs during the pandemic. And I think this is important, not only sort of from an economic perspective, but also from sort of a human perspective, because the occupations and industries that were having a really hard time filling these jobs and that were immigrant intensive are what we now think about as essential workers. So this includes food service, hospitality, healthcare, et cetera. And so this graph is just kind of drilling in on that point a little bit more. So this graph shows you across different caregiving, healthcare and other caregiving occupations, the percent of the occupation that was foreign-born over time. So the orange line is in 1980, and the blue or the green bars are in 2019. And the different occupations here are registered nurse, licensed practical nurse, health aide, health diagnostic, home health aide, and housekeepers and gardeners. And so essentially what this graph is showing is that the reliance in the US on foreign-born labor in these crucial caregiving occupations has gone up significantly in the last decades. And this is really important for a number of reasons. It's obviously really important as we see the huge demographic shifts that we're seeing in the US, particularly as the population ages and caregiving is going to become an even more important part of our economy moving forward. And then I also wanted to highlight some evidence from my own work that looks at immigration enforcement policies, particularly at the Secure Communities program, and basically shows that the removals that happened under that policy had harmful effects, not only for immigrants themselves, as we were hearing about in the last talk, but also for US-born workers. And so we document a couple of different ways that those kind of harmful spillover effects onto US-born workers occur. One of them is through this caregiving channel. So the idea is that when there's greater accessibility of caregivers, whether or not that's for the elderly or kids, that more people are able to work outside the home, and that is in fact what we find. So in our study, we find that the reduction of immigration in a local area reduces the likelihood that US-born people are likely to work outside the home. Another important finding from our work and other work on immigration and economics is that immigrants stimulate local demand. So immigrants are consumers just like everybody else, and they increase the demand for local goods. So thinking about restaurant meals, haircuts, that kind of thing, and that increases job creation. So there's multiple ways that these economic channels happen, and we have these positive spillover effects onto US-born workers. So now kind of thinking more a little about the pandemic, this graph is showing the rates of material hardship for immigrant families in the US in the early days of the pandemic. So this is a sample, this is from the Urban Institute, and the sample is restricted to Hispanic adults, and the colors are split by whether or not there's a non-citizen in the family in blue, or everybody in the family is a citizen in yellow here. And so what you can basically see is that rates of material hardship, however you want to measure it, which includes food security, not being able to pay bills, not being able to get healthcare, was significantly higher for families that had non-citizens in them relative to families that had citizens. And I want to highlight this because this is important, I think, not just for thinking about temporary hardship that was experienced in the early days of the pandemic, but I think this negative economic shock is going to persist. We're going to see sort of reverberations of this for generations to come. And to make that point a little bit more, I want to kind of pivot to talking about the safety net here. So this graph is kind of analogous to what I was showing you on the previous slide, but now this is rates of safety net participation, so rates of program receipt among, again, citizens in the blue and non-citizens in the orange here. And so this is in all of 2020. And what you can see, I think, really starkly is not only was hardship worse for non-citizen families, like I showed you in the previous graph, but they were less protected by the US safety net, which we know because of lots of, I mean, mechanically, there are lots of exclusionary policies that keep non-citizens from participating in the safety net. And that's basically what we're seeing translated here into this graph. So I think it's really striking that among citizens who were unemployed during the first year of the pandemic, 50% of them received unemployment insurance benefits, which is very high, but only about 30% received unemployment benefits among non-citizens. And then we see similar gaps for SNAP, or what used to be called food stamps. So even among low-income households who are likely to be eligible, we see about a 10 percentage point gap in the rates of receipt of this really important safety net program. And the far right set of bars is just showing you that for households with kids. And so going back to my point before about how this is going to kind of extend across generations, the lack of protection that immigrants had during this huge economic crisis in the US, as evidenced by these two sets of graphs, I think, as we know from economic research, is going to have really harmful effects on kids, both foreign-born and US-born kids that are growing up in the US right now. And this lack of protection and exclusion, I think, is going to be really harmful. That's what we're going to see. So unfortunately, not a positive note in terms of the experiences during COVID. But I do want to talk a little bit about kind of the state of policy around the safety net access for immigrants to kind of close out. So first, the initial recovery packages that were passed during the early days of the pandemic in the Trump administration were pretty exclusionary, maybe not surprisingly, of immigrants. So the major one, the CARES Act, didn't allow individuals to get stimulus payments if their spouse or dependent didn't have a social security number. And that you can see in this table basically excluded almost 5 million individuals who lived in these mixed status households. Additionally, as part of the initial expansions to the safety net, there were increases to SNAP benefits, but SNAP is only available to those who are authorized and to those who have lived in the US for at least 5 years. So that was also pretty limiting. On a more positive note, the major stimulus measure that was passed in December 2020 after Biden got elected was more inclusive. It did include mixed status families, which is what this table is showing you. So if spouses were undocumented or parents were undocumented, or parents were undocumented, then they were able to get stimulus payments under that December bill. So that was a positive change, but I think I want to kind of echo what people have said in the previous presentations, which is I think since this stimulus measure passed, there has not been a lot of positive action taken by the Democrats or Biden in the US. And so at the federal level, at least I'm feeling relatively discouraged, but I want to end by saying that at the state level, I think there maybe is some more room for hope in terms of ending these exclusionary policies. So we saw during COVID that a handful of states did step in where the federal government was not, and created programs to offer support for unauthorized immigrants. And actually Colorado, the state that I'm in now, is a really interesting example of this, I think, because in 2006, Colorado actually passed a show me your papers law. But just in the last couple of decades, we've really kind of swung to the opposite direction in terms of policymaking around immigration. And in the last couple of years, there have been a number of pro-immigrant policies passed, including creating a left behind worker fund, which was basically creating an unemployment insurance program for unauthorized immigrants who are working in Colorado. There was also legislation passed to allow unauthorized immigrants to receive public benefits here in Colorado, that are, besides unemployment insurance, to be able to get occupational licensing and a number of other things. So I think I'm a little bit more optimistic about these sub-federal level policy changes and the ability to really make some positive good at that level. So with that, I think I'll wrap up and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. I just have one little bit of data to throw into the pot here with respect to the partisan politics of immigration. The latest national survey that asked specifically about immigration, which was sponsored by NPR and came out just a few days ago, found that there was a large plurality of voters who believed that one party or the other was doing a better job of managing that issue area. The one big exception was immigration, which found a very divided US public. In fact, 34% of the interviewees thought that the Democrats were more likely to do better at managing immigration. 37% thought that the Republican Party would be better at it, and 28% were undecided. So what do you do with numbers like that if you're a strategist for one of these parties? That supports the notion, helps us to explain why immigration is not really at the very top of the agenda in either party. There's simply too much division in the electorate to be able to efficiently take advantage of it. So we tend to focus a little bit too much on the nativist Trumpist base. This is not an easy issue for politicians across the spectrum. The other thing I wanted to do is introduce a couple of data points from the work of Abigail Andrews. We had a more gender balanced panel here with Abigail's participation. She was unable to participate, but I did ask her to provide a summary of the findings from her fieldwork-based research among asylum seekers interviewed in Tijuana on the Mexican side of the border. And a couple of really fascinating data points. 93% of the roughly 500 asylum seekers that were interviewed by Abigail and her team had left home due to violence. Almost all of them fled in the dark of night, terrified by their own or their children's lives. So the whole economic justification for coming to the border pales in comparison with endemic home country violence. Also, very few of the people that were interviewed in that study had even heard of asylum when they left home. Virtually none of them have any knowledge of the basic principles of the US asylum system. In fact, when they left home, only about half intended to go to the US border at all. So what she documents, what they document in the research, is a huge information gap between what potential asylum seekers know about the asylum system and how it actually operates. And the implication of that to me is that regardless of what we end up doing about remain in Mexico or Title 42 or how we process asylum seekers when they come to the border is going to make much of a difference in terms of fueling future surges of migrants to the border. So I just leave you with that. Any of you who are interested in the detailed findings from Abigail's study, send me an email. I'll be happy to send the document to you. By the way, my email is Wayne Cornelius, run together 00 @gmail. And I'm going to be putting together the slides used by all of our panelists in one document. I'll be happy to send it to you if you ask for it. So we have roughly 25 minutes for Q&A. Please, any of the panelists or anybody else listening, jump in.
If I may, Wayne, I'd like to zoom out a little bit from these excellent presentations that we heard, and ask some questions that puzzle me about the United States. I guess they're economic and cultural questions. I start by affirming a few things that are like the ABC of migration studies, like wealthier countries have kind of negative natural rates of growth, and so in order to grow they really need immigration, right, in order to keep growing. But evidently, I guess Donald Trump put the US in quite a bit of a bind, as we heard from Chloe, because there's a very tight labor market right now, which was probably aggravated by the pandemic and all the dying, about 1 million people and so on and so forth. And so, the way I see, in kind of simplistic ways, the discussion in migration studies is that there are 3 main strands of interpretation. The xenophobic strand, I'll put it that way, that doesn't want to have anything to do with migrants. They should stay away from us. But then on the other end, there is the economistic strand that would like as many migrants as possible, because that's going to lower labor costs. And so I guess that's where at least a good chunk of business would be located, particularly those businesses, where, Chloe showed us some of those that are most dependent on immigrants or migrants. But so the question is, well, let me say that the third strand, I guess, is the social democratic strand of people who are concerned about, yes, we need migrants, but we need them to have at least the same rights, or well, the same rights as everybody else in this country, that meaning the United States. So, which of those strands prevails? Well, obviously, it seems like the xenophobic strand is having their day at the expense of the economistic or very liberal stand that would like many more immigrants to come in. And so I guess my question then is, why is it that those industries that are most dependent on migrant labor have such a low hand in this discussion? Is it because they're dependent on very precarious labor conditions that threaten the rest of the labor force, or why? I mean, why is there that kind of heavy hand on the part of the xenophobics? And, I mean, assuming that my characterization is okay, I mean, you can feel free to criticize my assumptions as well. So, but maybe Wayne, you can take another couple questions before.
No, let's just take yours, but I would throw it back to Chloe East, and if she could just discuss what's happening in the caregiving economy and why employers in that sector seem to be so disengaged from the policy debate.
Yes, I think that's a great question. And I think that my response is going to be a little cynical, but but I do think, I mean, essentially what we find is that when the presence of undocumented immigrants or likely undocumented immigrants, people who have ties to undocumented immigrants, when that number goes down, that it's harder to find childcare. So we find a reduction in sort of the availability, but we also see an increase in wages for caregivers who remain in that occupation. And the reason I say that is that I think it ties into what you were saying, which is that I think that we have essentially created sort of a new exploited class of workers by having undocumented immigrants in the US and not providing any protection for them. And I think that that's one reason that employers are going to be unlikely to want to advocate, for example, for a pathway to citizenship, is because without citizenship or other authorized status that is somewhat permanent, it's very easy to pay low wages, to have poor working conditions. I mean, we know a lot about like abuse that happens in those kinds of occupations. And so I think that may be one factor.
Let me throw it very briefly back to Mike Slaven on the same general topic. Mike's thesis is that business won't get involved, won't intervene actively unless there is a lot of potential damage. Okay, reviewing the data that Chloe has presented on the tens of millions of unfilled jobs throughout the economy, does that situation not rise to the level of a lot of potential damage? And is it simply unrealistic to think that an acute, pervasive labor shortage is going to translate into greater political activism, policy activism by the business community?
I mean, it could. I mean, and the potential would seem to be there. I guess going back to Gerardo's point, like there is that kind of liberal view that, okay, well, if for instance we had regularization, there's all sorts of evidence to suggest we'd have more productive workers, that there'd be more investment in skills, the economy would generally benefit from that. But the kind of the way that I guess organized business interests see it is not necessarily in line with the theoretical liberal view in terms of what are we actually doing here and what are we benefiting from. I guess I mean I would ask in a way about kind of, and Chloe would know a lot more about this, but kind of the organization of these these business interests that have these really intense demands for more workers, and whether, to the extent to which they can organize effectively politically, or they're just all small providers, or to the extent to what size of business they are would have an effect on this, and would have an effect on whether, I guess, they are able to command the attention of the Chamber of Commerce. But I think that there is obvious business interest in reforming immigration, because they have been at the table in the past, but politically it's not straightforward to them, because ultimately a lot of the time what they'd rather have is tax cuts and low regulation. And if there's a party that's willing to give them tax cuts and low regulation, and maybe not ask too many questions about undocumented workers, maybe ask more, I don't know. But if they're willing to give them that, but they're not willing to go there on immigration, well, I guess they will calculate that's better for them. I think your question, Wayne, is a great one, and it would seem to be very damaging not to address this. But in the larger scheme of who they've decided to cast their lot with and what that'll get them, I don't know.
Okay, maybe the contradictions haven't been heightened enough yet. Let's move on to a different topic. Somebody else want to get in?
Yes, I wanted to tackle also Gerardo's question, and the magic word here is workers.
Please speak up more.
Yes, the magic word here is workers. And what has changed dramatically in the course of the last 10 years in terms of migration flows in our migration system is that we're having less workers. What we see today, well, 10 years ago, 87% of those migrating into the US were men in working age, 16 to 45 years. This has changed dramatically since 2012. And what we see now is that almost 64% of those entering the southern US border are either families or unaccompanied minors. So, and the reason why this huge change is taking place is because one of the pushing factors of migration has changed dramatically from looking for a better life to actually running away from insecurity, as Wayne said. And this is absolutely true for the case of Central America in the course of the last 10 years. And now it has become true also for the Mexican case, at least after the COVID-19 pandemic. So as a German chancellor said, they wanted workers, and what they were receiving were human beings. And that's also something very relevant, because when you're a worker, you go and work and fill this labor shortage. But if you are a family or you are an accompanied minor, you will require public services like education, health, housing, etc. So that makes a huge difference in terms also of this increasing xenophobia. They want workers, they don't want human beings.
Thank you. Someone else jump in.
I had a question for David, actually. I wanted to ask how you think about racial profiling as affecting convictions in and of themselves. So like your measure of sort of criminality isn't really exogenous, or, you know, it's not innate. It depends on behaviors too, of police and other people.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely. So I think that's, you know, another reason to be very suspicious of using convictions as a way to prioritize, is that the convictions themselves are infected with all of these different problems. I think most prominently racial bias, and that one of the real advantages to reorienting the system away from relying on the criminal justice system would be that maybe it would become a little bit less racialized. And so I guess the argument is that even if we were to imagine that convictions were somehow a measure of some underlying criminality that may or may not exist, it's not a good idea. But there are, of course, these additional reasons to think it's a pretty terrible idea.
I wish we had had access to this research during the Biden campaign, when, as many of you know, I advised that campaign on immigration and asylum policy. And I have to say that there was really no systematic discussion of the issue of prioritizing deportations. It was just something pushed into a corner, and the overwhelming focus was on border management and anticipating and managing the next surge of asylum seekers. So
Yeah, and maybe I can add one thing there, which is that although I sort of emphasized what I described as good news, there's also really bad news under the Biden administration on this score, which is that it's adopted these really toothless priorities for the interior, in which ICE officers are kind of directed to weigh a range of factors. But the only time that we've seen priorities really work in the past was during this narrow window at the very end of President Obama's second term, when the priority enforcement program took effect. And the reason that program really worked is that it had bright line rules, and it had a kind of system for supervision where if you wanted to break the rule as an ICE officer, you needed a supervisor's agreement.
mhm.
And unfortunately, from my perspective, that program reduced the level of enforcement by prioritizing more by criminality. So I thought it was great that it reduced the level. I was disappointed with how it prioritized. And I think you could do something very similar with bright line rules to prioritize by ties. So you could imagine a rule that said, if you, ICE officer, want to proceed against someone who has been in the US for over 10 years, you need the approval of a supervisor, or against someone who has a minor child who is in their custody. Both of those rules, I think, would actually not create that much political controversy, though others can weigh in, and would, I think, prevent a lot of suffering.
You need to write and place a couple of good op-eds on this. It's really a subject that we need a lot more public discussion of. Somebody else jump in. We have about 7, 8 minutes left.
Just
Jorge
one short
has
comment on
his hand.
David's work. I love your work, David, and I think that you can actually measure the level of ties and the level of criminality, and therefore not only suppose what you're saying, but actually have hard data. And stronger ties, probably one of the easiest proxies to use would be time spent in the US and also hybrid families. One of the unintended consequences of deportations from inside the US is that today 700,000 US nationals, children, are in Mexico with their deported parents. So that is a huge unintended consequences. And in terms of criminality, you should also try to differentiate between the degrees of being a criminal. It's not the same to do shoplifting than to do homicide. So this information is available in the deportation trials of these people. You can actually measure that, and it will be, I can tell you, innovative and probably one of the most beautiful works on migration that have ever been done, and I would love to read it. So please continue on this trend.
So I should just respond that I'm hoping to do that. I've been stymied by some frustrating data problems. So one side of it is that sort of unbelievably, ICE only collects individuals' entry dates in a minority of individuals' cases. So most of the data is missing for length of stay in the United States in the ICE deportations data. So that's a great frustration of mine. There's, of course, like American Community Survey data on the population more generally. But then there's the difficulty that if you're trying to look at the level of ties of people who are institutionalized for crimes, they're not in their households in the survey. And so it's very difficult to get a measure of that overlap. But there is the information, of course, about ties overall and about criminality overall. So that information exists. It's the overlap, the correlation, that's hard to measure. But I am thinking about possible ways to do it. And I'd love to get, if you have other thoughts about how to do that, I'd love to get your thoughts probably later so I don't take up more time.
It's really amazing how much data ICE does not collect about the people that it's picking up. I happen to have an inside source in the Office of Immigration Statistics who happens to be one of my former PhD students. So I would be happy to field inquiries about specific types of data that you have identified that are not being gathered that might be fruitful as sources of future research. So send that on to me as well. Anybody else like to jump in? 5 minutes left.
Yeah, I want to just jump in and kind of ask David another question, but then kind of see if anyone else has any reactions to it. And this gets to a question that Wayne, you asked us, which is what can be done administratively, without Congress, because Congress isn't doing anything. My own perception, and David will know a lot more about this, I think, is that it seems a lot easier to break things administratively than to fix things, and that you can kind of just get rid of the guidance, let the ICE agents do whatever they want, radicalize them to a certain extent, and then 4 years later, when there's another administration that comes in and tries to put reins back on them, creates all these issues in trying to readjust the policy. So I was interested to see the reductions in the levels that you're talking about, David, and I'm wondering what you think about that in terms of, does this process of trying to put limits on immigration enforcement become just kind of more difficult over time?
Very quick response.
Yeah, so I guess I'm slightly more optimistic about it for some of the reasons you mentioned. It's possible that the pandemic is helping a little bit because there are capacity limits on detention centers at the moment. But I do think it's actually possible to control ICE agents through these administrative structures. At the border, it's become much more difficult, partly because the courts have been much more interventionist than they've ever been in the past, and it really seems to be limiting what the administration can do.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a whole area that we haven't really touched on, the extent to which the courts have jumped in many of these areas, often at the behest of Republican governors and attorney generals and other state and local actors. But it really has been roiling the whole policy environment at the federal level and impinging on what the feds can do in so many different areas. And of course, the litigation goes on and on. So we never really get a approximate resolution to any of this. They're about to kick us out of this room. So let me just profusely thank all of you who have participated. I think it's been a very fruitful, very interesting, substantive discussion across the board. Again, I'm happy to be the intermediary if anybody wants additional information and the slides and so forth. So please be in touch with me. Be happy to do that. And we look forward to the next Lhasa Congress. Thank you so much, everyone.